folks. Today we are joined by the FAA. We have John Meehan, who is going to be talking to us about operations over people and the recent changes to the Waiver program. So, John, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and the folks in the community, and hopefully they'll get a lot out of the conversation.
Outstanding. Well, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit more about you.
Okay.
How did you get into aviation? And I know that you've been at it for quite a while.
Yeah, well, I'm an old guy now, so it's a good story. My parents tell me my first flight was on a Lockheed Constellation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
And for those of you who are aviation people, you should go look it up. It's a beautiful aircraft. I was 6 weeks old and we flew to Germany from Kennedy. Yeah. But I've wanted to be a pilot my whole life. My dad was in the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam and spent a lot of time in helicopters, sent a lot of pictures home about helicopters. I built probably a dozen helicopter models. And when I went to the academy, I got my first helicopter ride in 1977, and I was hooked. I mean, that was it. It was very clear to me I wanted to be a helicopter pilot.
Yep.
And after graduation, I went to be an Army helicopter pilot, did that for a number of years. Then became an instructor pilot in the Army, which was really an awesome experience. And then years later, I went back and got my private fixed wing and instrument. And
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah, I'm fixed wing and rotorcraft and instrument and commercial. And then I also have my Part 107. So, and one of the things I really love about aviation, and as the community knows, it's a constant learning thing, and you never stop learning in aviation, which really for me is very appealing.
And especially with new technology that changes, like the drones do.
Like the drones, yeah.
It's kind of cool. You kind of like me, you've seen the manned aircraft side of things, and then now this drone side to me is very exciting because it changes so quickly.
Well, and I tell people one year is like 7 drone years.
Yes,
right? It's just the pace of change is just so amazing.
Yeah. So how did you go from that to joining the FAA?
Well, I've done a lot of different things in my life. I've sold airplanes. I've lived in Europe. I've done a lot of different industries. And in 2016, I was looking to do something different. And I had this epiphany, actually. My son was in college a few hundred miles away, and I thought about, gee, wouldn't it be cool to send him a care package via drone? Just from, I make it up and then put it on the shelf and launch it out there. And then about 5 minutes later, I thought, that's where I fly my Cessna 172, because there's a mountain there. There's a mountain between here and Blacksburg, Virginia. And I thought, wow, wait a minute, they're going to intermingle. And so that really triggered a lot of thought about drones and the utility of drones, and just started getting into it. And an opportunity came. I started meeting different people within the FAA, and they said, we're looking for people like you. And I thought it was a very good fit. My military time counted towards the federal retirement system as well, which was a nice plus. And both my sons ended up going to the service academy, so I didn't have any tuition bills to pay. Unlike you're going to have some, I'm sure. Yeah. So that made it a lot easier of a decision, and been doing it ever since. And I joined in 2017, and it's just hard to believe it's
right when it started, when Part 107
right after 107 came out,
Yeah.
and it's been an incredible ride. I mean, every day is a new day in what we do at the FAA with drones.
Yeah, well, and speaking of, so you've changed offices over time, and then now you're at kind of a new office that was created, AFS 751.
I'm in 751.
Yeah.
We're part of AFS 750.
So talk about AFS maybe for folks that don't understand how the FAA is kind of organized.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the FAA is really organized into different lines of business. We have aviation safety, which I'm part of.
That's AF.
AVS. And then within AVS is also AFS, which is flight standards. And I'm in flight standards. There's also the Office of Safety Standards. There's a lot of different entities within that line of business. Then many people are familiar with the Air Traffic Organization. Those are the air traffic controllers. Those are the center operators, those folks. So they're in the Air Traffic Organization. We have an airworthiness organization, and we have airports, a whole group within the FAA that does nothing but work on all those different airports. There's there's over 19,000 airports out there.
Oh, I didn't realize there's that many.
It's a huge number.
Yep.
And then there's also the Aviation Safety and Hazardous Materials, we call them ASH. Yeah, so it's a big organization, and so I am inside that AVS line of business, and what we do in flight standards is I guess you could say we're the rules people. So we're the people who interpret the rules, and within our organization are where the flight standards district offices are. So those would be the people who do what we call surveillance. That's checking, I call it, and then also investigations if there's a crash or a complaint.
So if you get ramp check, it's coming from
the flight standards, the General Aviation Safety Organization, which is GASA, we call it, and that's the FSDOS, the Flight Standards District Office.
Okay. Yep. So AFS 751 was recently created. Why is that? What's different about?
Yeah, great question. So we created a group called AFS 700, and this is the Emerging Technologies Division. And really, I think it was a great move because they were trying, up until that moment, which was a few months ago, we were trying to do drones as part of everybody's typical job. So you'd have fixed wing or manned aviation activities going on and drone activities. And the pace, as we talked about earlier, the pace of change with drones is just so rapid that the strength of the organization was being diluted. And so I think good call leadership. I think they made a good decision to pull out the UAS specialists, put them together so that we can collaborate across lines of business and focus more on UAS specific stuff.
Which is interesting because obviously the FAA forever has been a manned aircraft organization, and now trying to organize, I can't imagine trying to organize something this big for a technology that's going so quickly and taking, I'm not going to say market shares, but market shares is kind of the idea, right, on both sides. So there's a lot of users compared to manned aircraft pilots now. Way more.
Yeah. You think about how the FAA was originally set up, right, and it goes back to the early 20s. If you look at all the history, but the FAA was created really in the 50s, and let's say since the Wright brothers first flew in 1903. 03?
Yep.
Since then, right, here we are a lot of years later, and we've got, 80 to 100,000 manned aircraft registrations. And in 3 years with drones, we had
over 1 million.
Well, and so the crossover point happened pretty rapidly, and it's been a little bit of a challenge for the FAA to kind of get their heads around it as well. Yeah,
well, and understandably so, I think. I always has this theory that manned aircraft aviation, kind of the regulation started with being very simple, and then get more complex as aircraft get more complex, as more people get into the system. And I think on the drone side, it almost feels like the FAA started kind of at the top of like the more complex regulation, and now is loosening things as they better understand.
Well, I think that's one way to look at it. I think the other way is when you look at 107, where a lot of people get confused about what does 107 mean, what does 91 mean, and the aviation flight rules are under Title 14, and within Title 14 there's different parts, right? And Part 107 is for the civil drones that weigh under 55 pounds.
Small and man, yep.
Right, and then you have Part 91, which was traditional aviation, which is when every time you fly to another show that your guys are flying under Part 91.
Yep.
There's also some drone work that happens under Part 91 that we could talk about if you want. But all of that, when they looked at how do we get started with this drone stuff, right? Because there were already questions and requests coming in way before 2016.
Oh yeah. Well, Section 333 was one of them.
Yeah, and so I think they really looked at it and said, well, what's the low risk? So I think the FAA's approach was, let's start with the low risk kind of operations, which are the smaller drones under 55 pounds, under 400 feet, and then let's build a set of rules around that with and the drone pilot is in the loop, I think that's an important distinction, right? The very important underlying principle of Part 107 is the drone pilot is inside that loop.
It's not autonomous, is what you're saying. Yeah.
And so let's see how that goes. Let's learn a little bit about it. And there was a lot of uncertainty. And you think about the way the FAA looks at the rules is, here are the rules. You must follow those rules. And if you want to do something different, you either have to get a waiver to that or an exemption. And the existing rule for aircraft was Part 91.
Yep.
And they looked at the hundreds. I can't even remember how many Part 91 regulations there are. There's a lot.
Oh, definitely over 100.
Yeah. And you look at those regulations, and it was clearly not a fit. And so that's where the whole idea of, hey, let's create a new part that's just for this small UAS, and let's see how it goes.
And I think there's been a lot of logic that followed from, because I remember reading this the first time, Part 107, as a Part 61 pilot that flew under Part 91 for a long time, and I would see a lot of commonalities. We talked about this yesterday. The careless and reckless 91-113 became 107-23. So all these kind of followed.
Definitely.
And the drugs and alcohol even is referred to Part 91. There's a reference to that in the rule. So I think that makes sense. And then Part 135, which is for drones that are operated for doing transportation of goods beyond visual line of sight.
Or across state lines.
All that, they had to kind of use something that's existing.
And who wrote the rules? Well, the people who are already there, right?
Yep.
You're not going to hire new people off the street to go write these. So, and their whole orientation bias, if you will, is Part 91. You start with a framework. We all function that way. So you start with that framework, and that's why you do see a lot of similarities between Part 107 and Part 91. They said, well, this is a good one. Let's just
the distance from clouds is another one, and visibility. So so recently the FAA decided to kind of make changes to the waiver process to make it easier for folks to fly over people. So a little bit of background. Obviously, in 2019, we saw a regulation change, which is different, right? So. And we saw new categories of drones, category 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we didn't see really a whole lot of manufacturers going after the certification. We see them now that this work has been done. Now we have.
I'm going to claim some responsibility for that.
Good. But through parachutes. So we'll get to that. But can you talk maybe a little bit about the motivation behind making the change to make those waivers?
That's a great question. So, and I think this is important for you folks in the community to understand that when the FAA has in effect a feedback loop on how did we do with our first pass at these regulations, right? The Part 107 came out in 2016, and one of the feedback loops for the FAA is looking at the number of waiver requests or the number of exemption requests, because that tells the FAA, gee, did we miss something? Did we get something right? And what was interesting is by far the number one waiver request was to operate at night. And the number two, very closely behind, was we want to operate over people. And if you took those two, and that's why that rule changed when it happened.
In 2019,
focused on those two.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
That's why that happened. And if you looked at, there were thousands of waiver requests that were coming in. And so obviously the FAA wanted to find a way to normalize that, to make it more routine. And so that's when we went under the process to revise. And so night is done, and night seems to be working quite well, I think. But I think it's fair to say that we were a little bit surprised that these categories of drone operations that we created and the categories of drones that were accepted to be compliant didn't quite work out the way we were expecting it to.
Why do you think that is?
That's probably a question that's best answered by the manufacturers. I come from private industry, and I know from my experience in private industry that there's a lot of reasons why companies do things and not. But that's really probably best. I mean, I'm sure you've asked them. I mean, what did they tell you?
So it's a mix of things. The one of them is the fact that the United States is only one market, and a lot of drone manufacturers, especially the big one like DJI, they make drones for the entire world.
That's true.
And so making any changes, I think the biggest issue was this 250 gram limit with prop guard, because there are a lot of 250 gram drones, and I think manufacturers went after that because all over the world it became kind of a standard. So it's easy for DJI, which is global, to go and create a 250 gram drone without prop guard. But now with this category 1, a prop guard was added on top of it, and now none of the drones are compliant because none of the markets have something like that.
But the real interest is not so much the category 1s, and I think the real interest
that's
is
the easy one.
Yeah,
that's the easy
a
one,
good point.
because the 2 and 3 take a lot of paperwork.
Yeah.
And so
Yes, they do.
the paperwork to the FAA, the MOC, the means of compliance and the declaration of compliance, I think they just were not interested in doing that paperwork. And then you also have to look at the size of the market of people that might be interested in buying that. And as much as we think that people want to fly over people, they want to do it with the cheapest possible equipment. And I think that would add a big premium on top of the drone. So that's my guess why.
Yeah.
And you know, talking to some people, there's a lot of that.
and you know, from the FAA, I mean, I don't think it's appropriate that for the FAA to speculate on why they did that, but it is interesting. I do think it's fair to say that we were a little surprised that there wasn't an immediate market response to do that. And,
so,
and this kind of leads into probably your next question was, so what happened next, right?
Well, and also because of that, you get a lot of requests, a lot of waiver requests.
Well, the need for waivers really never went away.
It never went away, yeah.
Which was a surprise.
Yeah.
You know, and that really drove us to think, well, okay, well, we still have to process these waivers. They're still coming in at a large amount, right? So the backlog is building. Most people failed in their application to address the concerns of the FAA. They failed to either describe the operation. They failed to make the case that it would be as safe or more safe than what the regulation already required. A lot of reasons, but so the need really never went away.
Yep.
And so we had to take another look at this as, okay, well, we've still got the backlog. The backlog is still increasing.
Yep.
The denial rates are still significant. I mean, only 3% were getting approved.
Wow.
A 97% denial rate, which is not good for anybody.
No.
Right? It's not good for the FAA.
Yep.
That's a waste of time.
Yeah.
Right? And a waste of productivity, and it's a waste of everybody's time. But clearly there is a legitimate public interest and a need to operate over people sometimes, not all the time.
Yep.
Right? So we had to figure out another way that, hey, there's got to be a better way. And so we took a step back and we looked at what are the hazards of operating over people, and can we zero in on those hazards and then figure out some mitigations that would address those hazards.
Yep.
And then maybe we should modify our guidelines to be simpler and more focused to address those hazards and the risks.
Yep.
And then you come up. So that's what we did. And what was interesting is we looked at the data, and all of you know that when you have a incident or a safety event under Part 107, it has to meet that criteria, and you report that criteria. Well, very few incidents were getting reported to the FAA that involved either serious injury or damage to property over $500. Very few, amazingly few.
Yep.
And then when you look at the serious injury, that data set shrinks even more. I mean, less than a handful.
Yep.
In 8 years. So we looked outside the FAA for some data, and we found some very good data, and that showed that there are things happening with drones that
just not being reported.
They're not being reported because they don't meet the reporting criteria threshold for the FAA, but they did for the hospital folks. And what we discovered was that, and I think a little bit to our surprise, was that the number one risk of injury to a person from a drone is a laceration.
Yep.
By far. Like, it's not from a concussion. which I think when we wrote the 10739 rule, I think we were focused on the kinetic energy, right? And why? Well, because if it hits you in the right spot, it can kill you. Right? So, but that really, the data for the last 8 years said, well, that's not happening, which was a surprise. And so we took a look at that, and so that was one of the hazards that we identified as, hey, if you're operating over people,
you need prop guards. Or
the risk is you're going to cut it. It'll fall and hit them and cut them.
Yep.
Right. That's the number one risk. So how do you deal with that risk?
Yep.
Prop guards.
Prop guards
or some other mechanism to stop the props from rotating to cause a laceration. So that's where that came from.
Yeah.
And then the other mitigation or the other hazard that we identified was that, and I've said this a number of times, but we've had 12 collisions since 2017 between drones and manned aircraft, either totally confirmed or deemed highly probable. And when we looked at that, so that's a risk. And when you're operating over people, where's your attention, right?
Right there.
It's right there.
Yep.
Right. It's not up here.
Yep.
And it's not, it's not swiveling in a 360 degrees. So that was an added distraction because if you're operating over people, you need to be concerned about those people, right?
Yep.
So you have another distraction, which is increases the likelihood of a collision. So that's where the anti-collision light came in.
And the VO to be able to
give you that extra situational awareness, right? And that's what drove that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we got to where we were. And then I think that really simplified our approach as well. Say, well, okay, and then we still wanted to get rid of the backlog, right? And so we said, well, what are most of these requests? What kind of drones are they, right? Are they all the big matrices or larger? Are they, no. Most of them are.
Most people fly small drones.
Yeah, they fly small drones. So let's do the 90-10 rule. Let's figure out how to solve the 90% requests, and we get all that off the table. We get those folks operating. They're lower risk, right? Lower kinetic energy. So why don't we focus on that? And that's what we did. That was
the 400 grams.
Yep.
Yeah. So 400 grams, you have a VO because you need to be able to see. You need a light so that you can be visible.
Yep.
And then prop guards.
Yep.
And then that gets you you've checked pretty much all the boxes that makes the FAA feel good that you're going to be operating safely. Then you need to describe your operation and how you're going to be doing this, you know, safely.
Yeah, and we also took the opportunity, we recognized that a lot of folks in the community are new aviators. I call them novice aviators. And I do a lot of work with public safety, and it's very clear to me that they're very good about ground risk. They're not so good with air risk, and they need structure. And so we also took the opportunity to, hey, why don't we give them a little bit more pre-flight planning structure to make them take a look at the area you're going to be operating on. Is there a hospital helipad over here? There might be. What's going to be around a hospital helipad? Let me think for a minute, right? Maybe helicopters?
Yep.
Are helicopters always talking on the radio? No, they're not.
Yep.
Are helicopters always using ADS-B in? No, they're not.
No.
So that's where the VO come in also, and the anti-collision light, so that that gives that helicopter or the ag operator a chance to see that drone from farther away to avoid that.
Yep.
Long answer, I know. But.
No. I think this is great information. I think the logic behind it will help people remember why it's in place.
Yes, I hope so.
For me, I love knowing, why it happened, because then I can easily explain it and remember it.
And hopefully they'll say, that makes sense to me. I'm good with that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what my hope is.
And I think obviously the results have shown now. How long has it been? 6 months since this went in place? A little bit less than that.
June.
Yeah. So what are the results now? We went from 3% approval, 90%, 97% failure to what?
56% approval, 44% denial.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? 44% denial? Come on.
But so why is that? Why are the denials?
That was another interesting thing is, it's obvious why they got denied, because they never answered the questions.
Yep. Yeah. So what's called the WSEG, right? I don't know what it even stands for.
The Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines.
So there's a PDF that you can download that I recommend that you do download that tells you the questions that you should be answering. It doesn't tell you the answer, but it gives you the question.
Yeah, and we there were 2 questions.
Yeah.
I mean, we changed it to be 2 questions, and the first question is describe the operation. Why do you need to operate over people?
Yeah.
And I call it the who, what, when, where, how, and why, right? And then how much does the drone weigh with all this required equipment, right? Because you're going to have remote ID. So most of them now have it standard. But if you don't have it, you have to add the broadcast module. You have to add those prop guards. You have to add that. And if the weight requires a parachute recovery system, you got to add that in. And they weren't answering. Or they would say, okay, I'm going to have all that stuff, and my drone weighs 0.88 pounds. And we're not that gullible. Yeah,
so 400 grams is the limit for not having a parachute. Anything over that, you'll need to have a parachute that's ASTM approved.
Yep, it conforms to it. Yep. It conforms to the ASTM F3322-18 or newer standard.
Yep. Can you talk a little bit about the process of making these changes internally, and maybe the difference between this and why it's not a regulation change? I don't know that everybody is aware of what it takes to do a regulation change versus an internal procedure change.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I have to preface my answer. I'm not a regulations process expert, but we do have them here at the show, so you should definitely hit them up. But the regulation, to make a change in the regulation is a very long process. Sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years, or even longer. Whereas a waiver, there is some flexibility to the FAA that we have to look at the concept of the operation and the safety mitigation case, and then we can say, okay, this is an equivalent or better level of safety, so we don't need to go through the regulation process, which is farther down the road, much longer, and we want to fix it today, right? And so fixing it today, and certainly it should inform future rulemaking, right? That what we're doing today with these waivers.
For possibly another change like we saw in 2019.
It could.
Can you talk about maybe the behind the scene process of what happens after I submit my waiver? I click submit, then where does it go?
Well, first you follow the yellow brick road to Oz, and then there's a man behind the curtain.
Which is you?
Definitely not me.
Definitely not you.
They don't give me the keys to that one. No, that's a great question. The process for a Part 107 waiver is to go to FAA Drone Zone, FAA.gov, make sure it's got a GOV suffix there. But you go there, and in the FAA Drone Zone, it's a portal that you basically go through the different steps and the questions. And you'll see early on when you go for either an airspace authorization or an operational waiver, you would click the radio button that says operational waiver. And that routes that to the Flight Standards Organization. If you click the radio button of airspace authorization, that routes that to the Air Traffic Organization. So that's where they bifurcate the process. And so when you're doing one of those waiver requests, and you can go to 107.205 to see what regulations in 107 are waivable. And then if you wanted to get a waiver for one of those regulations, then it's going to take you through a series of questions and drop downs. It's a fairly long process, but with an hour or two, you should be able to get through it. And then you're going to submit that. And then from there, it goes to, I liken it to a triage. It goes to some contractors, some FAA contractors, who will look at the waiver application and give it that initial sniff check. That, did they answer the questions? No. Denied.
Goes back.
Or they were close, but they probably need to be a little bit more information. They're going to send what's called an RFI, request for information. So they'll triage it a little bit. They'll see if it's generally fits within the guidelines, and then if it's close or definitely meets it, they'll then forward it over to an aviation safety inspector who's in AFS 751, my team. that I work with, and then they will look it over and make the decision to either approve it, deny it, or go back to the applicant to say, hey,
RFI,
tell me more about this.
Yep.
And a good one would be maybe the person left out something about having prop guards or something. They might go back and say, hey, go back and weigh it with the
So
proper.
if it gets denied, there's a likely chance that it was pretty far off. It's missing a lot of information.
Yeah.
And then, but if you get an RFI, you're probably pretty
You're close.
You
Yeah,
just
you're
need
more
to
than
tweak
50% correct.
Yeah, interesting.
If you're more than 50% wrong,
any tips for people that get, because you don't always get a reason why it was denied, which sometimes I find frustrating. We've submitted a few of them that just get denied, and we don't always understand why, because we obviously try to do our best.
yeah, if there's, let's look at something like a 10731, which has a lot of waiver safety explanation guidelines. You know, there's a lot of questions that you have to answer.
Yeah.
If you don't
That's BVLOS.
That's a BVLOS one.
Beyond visual line of sight.
Yeah, and let's say, so what happens when they just get the outright denial? Well, I think there's, I'm going to guess here, 30 or 40 questions.
There's a lot of questions.
There's a lot of questions,
Yep.
right? And the denials are, I'm going to be safe.
Yes.
And they never answer those questions. That's an easy one, right? Or they'll go through and say, and they won't answer any of the questions, or they'll answer a few of them. I'm a good guy. You should let me fly. You know, BVLOS. Well, we know you're a good person, but that doesn't help us justify to the American people that we allowed you to operate that way in their national airspace system. You know, so that's the idea there. So if they've made a good try, and we recognize that these are novice aviators, right? That not everybody's Chuck Yeager, right? Like you and me. But we know we have to go back and maybe do a little bit of coaching. And sometimes one of the suggestions I have for the community here is, maybe if you get a denial and you're pulling your hair out, you can't, you know, what the heck? I gave it my best shot. I would recommend they reach out to the UAS Support Center.
Yep.
UAShelp@fa.gov. and start a conversation with them. They're very helpful people, and I know them all, and a lot of them will help coach them.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. They're absolutely a great team that and replies very quickly.
Yeah,
that's always amazes me that I send an email usually within a day
they
or
really
24 hours.
They
I
really
usually
care,
get something.
you know, and I do lurk on their inbox, so I do watch. It also helps me understand what are the current issues going on in the community. And that helps me because one of my roles, we never talked about it, but a big part of my job is educating my own colleagues internally. I do a internal webinar every couple of weeks for our FSDOs and our air traffic, and helping them understand drone policy, drone rules.
So you do your own news update
I
internally?
do. Oh, absolutely.
It's
I do.
the FA
I
drone
call it
news
"and the
updates.
answer is." Yeah, I do. And the answer is.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I plagiarize, you know, some guy in Prescott.
So you mentioned that the Flying Over People waiver was one of the most popular. Night, obviously, no longer a waiver.
Well, we still do night waivers, believe it or not, for drone light shows. They need a waiver.
Because they don't have a strobe light.
Well, and yeah, because they're going to want to take off the strobe for that particular operation.
So that's what you would
pretty
need.
much.
Pretty
much.
What's the next one now that's the largest that we can see? I'm trying to see which regulation is going to change in the future.
Well, I had a list here. I think after night, it was the operations over people, operations over moving vehicles, maybe.
Yeah.
But we've kind of done them. Actually, not kind of. We've done them together. It's the same criteria.
Yeah.
And then I think it's going to be the BVLOS.
BVLOS.
I think so.
I knew this was going to be my next question.
So. Oh boy.
Smooth transition. So BVLOS, there's been a lot of talk, and as we're recording this, I want the audience to understand that this is September of 2024. And so as you watch this, there may have been changes, obviously, but the FAA has been talking about a notice of proposed rulemaking for beyond visual line of sight flying. We don't have a ton of details yet because it's supposed to come out at the end of the year, but I don't think it is.
Yeah. So that's probably the next big project that you're going to see is trying to find a way to normalize beyond visual line of sight operations into the NAS, because it's clearly, it's got bipartisan support from Congress, and Congress has put instructions into the FAA Reauthorization Act. And if you want to look up what that entails, just on your favorite search engine, Public Law 118-63. That's the current FAA Reauthorization Act. And you can look at what that bill contains and what it's telling the FAA to do, and where it's allocating money to do that. And so one of those areas that has focus is, how do we normalize, make routine safely beyond visual line of sight operations in the National Airspace System? And you've heard me talk about this before, but I mean that will be if we can get that right, that will be a serious game changer in a positive way, allowing economies of scale and large scale operations, and really see the true potential of what drones can do.
So I don't want to speculate on what's going to be in this thing, because either you know and you don't want to talk, or you don't know, either way.
It's probably the latter.
Yeah, and because you probably won't get involved with that until it's all published anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I do want to talk about the difficulty of integrating drones right now to fly beyond visual line of sight, because I think this is an issue that we can clearly talk about. The difficulty is that there is a lot of other aircraft that are flying in the airspace at the same time as drones, and now we are asking for drones to fly beyond visual line of sight and rely more or less on instruments on board the aircraft, right? So can you talk about detect and avoid and the difficulty with this, and then maybe the ecosystem that we need to have in place in order to do this?
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to what we talked early on, where the FAA was a manned aircraft organization that has all of this in place right now with ATC and actual humans that are directing aircraft. But that's going to change with drones, right?
So I think we have to take a step back to one of the foundational principles of the National Airspace System, which is see and avoid.
See and avoid.
Right? And if you think about, and a lot of people don't really understand that the way the government and the FAA view airspace is it's a system. And if you've ever had engineering, you know that like an engine is a system, right? It consists of different components that must all function correctly in order for the system to work, right? So the system, the National Airspace System, consists of air traffic controllers, mechanics, pilots, aircraft operators, all of it, all those VORs that are out there, right? All the navigation aids. So all of that is a giant system, and that system is built on one foundational principle, which is that see and avoid, right? Why is that? Well, that's because if you and I are both flying in our aircraft and we lose all radios, we lose all navigation, we lose everything, right? But it's still flying. We can still use our M1A1 eyeball and see each other and avoid each other, right? I see you, you see me, and so that's a fundamental responsibility under Part 91. That the pilot must be vigilant at all times to see and avoid other aircraft. That's still there. And so how do you do that with a drone that doesn't have a pilot on board, doesn't have those eyes? Well, it has to have some means of detecting that other aircraft so that it can then execute something to avoid that other aircraft, right? So how do you do that with a drone? And a drone that you don't have that screen, and the issue I think with drones, most of the drones out there, they have their camera systems and they're really good, seeing what's directly in front of them.
It's about this much, right? Of a view angle, but as a pilot, you can do this and you can do this and you can...
Even in my helicopter, I could look back and see, like this.
All the way around,
right? All the way around. And so how do you do that when the drone has a camera system in it? So it's going to need some ability to sense in X, Y, and Z axis. Out how far? Well, far enough to avoid a collision. That's as we know, we've talked about this before.
It happens
12
quickly.
and a half seconds, right?
The reaction time, and especially when it's coming from behind, you have to think about that, because drones are going to be the slowest in the airspace, more than likely, compared to a helicopter or an airplane.
So they'll overtake you from any direction. and above and below.
Yep.
And so how do you do that? That's the fundamental challenge of enabling drones to really take off and become economically viable, is that we've got to figure out a way to do that. And one of the reasons why it's been such a challenge to date is the technology isn't there yet.
Yep. And right? I think there's a lot of money being spent on detect and avoid technology. And there's different ways of doing it. Sensors on board the aircraft, which are getting better, and then sending the signal. The problem also is that we do have technology right now to find where airplanes are located and helicopters using ADS-B, but it's not a perfect solution because not everybody's using it.
That's right.
And then we have radars, but they're complex and it's hard to have them, and expensive, and you just can't have one of those on board. So it's going to be a mini radar of sorts, but then we also have data from possibly remote ID, which initially was kind of pitched as a way for UTM, for unmanned traffic management.
That's still one of the goals of remote ID, is eventually it might be used to inform position of aircraft. But today that's not the case.
Today is not the case, And I think the network remote ID is really what the idea was with that, but it's also complex for the majority of users. So I don't think there is an easy answer, quite frankly. And I've been studying this for quite a while. I don't think there's an easy answer to make this happen. So,
and it's certainly not going to be cheap.
No, it's not going to be cheap. So
who's going to pay for that?
Well, yes, and I think also I hear a lot of folks on forums talking about how this is going to be allowing everyone and anyone to fly beyond visual line of sight in the near future. And I'm saying, hold on, step back. This may not be as easy as you think. And I think setting the expectation now is going to prevent a lot of people from getting very disappointed down the road when those regulations come out.
That's a smart approach.
Because I think it's being oversold a little bit right now. I don't know. Maybe I'm a pessimist in this case. I'm usually not, but we'll find out.
One of the reasons why the federal government has a process of putting a notice out of a proposed rule change is to allow all of the stakeholders, all the people who have skin in the game, to look at it and think about, well, how's that going to impact me and what I do, and then to provide comments. And maybe some folks have a better idea. I know maybe some of your community, they've got they'll read through the notice of proposed rulemaking and say, well, I know a better way to do this, and please do.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments.
I would expect
50. So. How many? 50,000.
We got 54,000 on the RID.
On remote ID.
Yeah.
So.
And we read, believe it or not, we read every single one, and if we try to group them together, but all of those individual unique answers do get responses.
And you can read that in the final ruling, the preamble of the regulation. You can always read the comments and how the FAA responds to them. And I find that it's a 700-page document sometimes, but I actually find it fascinating. I read all of it.
In my opinion, in fact, that's a good segue to tell the folks in the community. If you really want to understand what the FAA is thinking about a rule, Part 107 in particular, Part 48, if you really want to understand the rest of the story, you need to read the preamble. Because when I first got to the FAA, they said, read the preamble. And what's that? I just knew about I'd get my Jeffersons out and I'd read the rules, but there's a lot more behind it, and it's in the preamble. I probably read the Part 107 preamble 20 times.
Oh, I go back to it occasionally. When people ask me, they're like, where is this in the regulation? I say, well, it's not in the regulation, but read the preamble because it will explain and kind of get in the FAA's brain.
And the preamble is part of the regulation.
And it can be used.
A lot of people don't get that, but that preamble is considered part of that regulation, and you should know it.
So it can be used in court against you.
Yeah. Well, not in court, but
no, I know. In an investigation. I don't want you to speculate, so I'm going to speculate on that very last question. But I believe that whatever beyond visual line of sight is likely going to be added to the back of your certificate. Right now, if you look at your certificate, it's a remote pilot certificate with a small unmanned aircraft rating. Would that be a rating? No, just a small unmanned aircraft.
I have to go look at mine.
My guess is that beyond visual line of sight will become some kind of a rating.
I'm not really sure.
In the back.
I hear a lot of different things, but really, I'm looking forward to the publication as well as you, because There's a small group within the FAA that works on it, and it is considered confidential information until it gets released.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, because there could be a lot of games going on if we didn't do it that way. And so I'm just as curious as you as to what's going to come out of that. We could certainly speculate, but I don't know if that's really...
No, and I don't want to. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have more conversation when that comes around.
I would think so.
Yeah, that's going to keep you busy and us very busy as well.
That's right. I'll be watching the Pilot Institute Q&As more often.
Yes. Yeah, we'll be busy around that time with Q&As. All right, folks, well, this is it. John, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And for those of you that don't know, we are at Commercial UAV Expo recording these, so we will have a lot more of these interviews with other folks, with me and without me in the picture, but I really wanted to sit down with John and kind of pick his brain on this, so thanks.
Thanks very much. Fly safe, everybody.